dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who has joined us online or will later watch this video. Welcome to a new virtual event convened by the Geneva Environment Network in partnership with the Climate Finance Unit of the United Nations Environment Programme. We will be discussing the findings of a new report on the state of finance for nature in the G20 that has been launched today. The analysis was led by various institutions that will be mentioned by our panelists, two of them being based in Geneva, the United Nations Environment Programme Climate Finance Unit, with whom we are convening this event, World Economic Forum. This new study comes ahead of various important negotiations for the future of our planet, including the meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, which subsidiary body meetings should convene in March in Geneva. The guide and moderator, the chair of the session today is Justin Adams. To him, let me remind you that the documents presented, the summary, the report, as well as the video of the discussion will be made available on the webpage. Throughout the event, you can raise your questions by using the Q&A box. We will answer these in the Q&A and discussion session. With that, Justin, over to you.
Diana, thank you very much. And Your Excellencies, ladies, gentlemen, thank you for being with us this afternoon as we talk about this new report that we are delighted to launch together with UNEP and the ELD, the Economics of Land Degradation Unit, and the GIZ from Germany. This builds on the report that we did last year, talking about the state of finance for nature, where we identified this very significant funding gap that exists. And as we look out to 2050, this $4 trillion, let's add 3 zeros, to the very significant amount of investment that is going to be needed if we're going to really address our biodiversity goals, the land degradation goals that we have, as well as the climate goals. And I think what we have seen in the last 1 to 2 years is just the increasing recognition of how central nature is to our economy. It provides the clean water, the clean air. It's the very basis of which all of our food production is dependent. And so if we continue to degrade it, we will continue to erode the future of our children and future generations. So it's absolutely critical that we really understand this financing gap and that we understand how we can close the financing gap. So to build on the report we did last year, and I should call out Vivid Economics, who are also with us today, who've led so much of the analysis. So a huge thank you to them and their team. But as we look to build on last year's report, today's report is very much focused on the G20 and the opportunity that the G20 has to really lead on this agenda. And you'll hear some of the data presented shortly, but we just think it's so important that the G20 prioritize this and demonstrate the leadership that is required as we look to closing the gap. And so that's really what this is about. I'm delighted to sort of be moderating the session. We're going to be exploring the questions of how we do bridge the gap, particularly ahead of the very important COP15 meeting. Now, we're going to be looking at how we can increase development finance, and we're going to be looking at some of the policy instruments, some of the opportunities to increase private sector finance as we move forward. So these are all questions that are on our minds, and I would be encouraging people to use the Q&A function that you can see in the WebEx that we can now that you can be posting questions for us as we go through this. So the format will be, we're going to have a couple of opening remarks, and I'll introduce the panelists in a minute. So we'll hear from them, and then we'll go to there we go, there's the agenda. So we've got some opening remarks from David Cooper, Deputy Director for the CBD, clearly the crucial secretariat for driving the biodiversity agenda. So great, David, you can be with us. Then we'll hear from Claudia Hieper from the German government about Germany, particularly in this crucial year when you host or hold the G7 presidency. And Claudia is the Deputy Head of Division in the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ. And so we'll hear from Claudia, and then we'll go into the sort of the presentation, a few slides that we'll see from Ivo Mulder, who's really been leading so much of this work from UNEP, the climate finance unit head at UNEP. So delighted to have Ivo there. And I know we have Mateo Salazar with us as well, if needed for some of the technical questions on the report as well. So that's who you'll be hearing from. We will be finishing promptly at 4 p.m. Europe time. And so without further ado, let me introduce or hand over to David, who do the initial opening remarks. So David, really keen to hear from you ahead of COP15 and the CBD Secretariat perspective on this.
Thank you very much, Justin, and thank you for the opportunity to, on behalf of the CBD, on behalf of Elizabeth Moema, the Executive Secretary, and all my colleagues to participate in this important event. And I'd like to thank UNEP, the World Economic Forum, and the Eliminating Land Degradation Initiative of GIZ and Vivid Economics for addressing this important issue. And indeed, 2020 is set to be a key year for nature, with the second part of COP15 taking place later this year. We're very pleased that we've just been able to confirm that the preparatory meetings for that will be taking place in Geneva in March to prepare, of course, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which is then due to be adopted at COP15 later this year, and is due to set the agenda for global action on biodiversity to 2030 and to 2050. But of course, also we have this year the COPs of the Desertification Convention and the Climate Convention. And one key issue, of course, here is looking at these three issues together. They are really all different facets, in fact, we would argue, I think, of one major challenge that we have. We know from recent assessments, from the Best Global Assessment, from the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook, and of course some recent World Economic Forum reports as well, that we're losing biodiversity at rates that really threaten to jeopardize the continued provision of ecosystem services or nature's contributions to people. And this will, if it's not addressed, it will undermine progress, economic progress, social progress. It will jeopardize achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. We also know, though, from those same reports, that if we take action, we can halt and reverse biodiversity loss. We can bend the curve. We can put nature on a path to recovery. And in fact, this imperative and this ambition was agreed by governments in the first part of COP last year in the Kunming Declaration, where ministers committed themselves and committed countries to take the actions necessary to develop a post-2020 framework, to implement a framework that can do that put nature on a path to recovery. But we know to do that will require these major transformative changes across societies, across economies, and that obviously will mean mainstreaming the values of biodiversity across everything we do as individuals, as businesses, as governments. It will require a integration of biodiversity values across economies, and an important part of that will be finance. As you were saying just now, Justin, we have this finance gap of some 4 trillion, as according to the State of Nature Finance report. We have more investment currently that is harming nature than supporting it, and we need to turn this around. The post-2020 framework, the draft framework, already sets out an ambitious framework to do that. Of course, this is still under negotiation. It includes, of course, ambitious goals for nature itself, for biodiversity, for species, for ecosystems, for genetic diversity for 2030 and for 2050. And it provides a holistic approach where nature also contributes to other global challenges, the climate challenge, mitigation and adaptation, health, food production and the like. So these so-called nature-based solutions, of course, will be a key part of any future strategy going forward. And it's good to see the focus of this additional report on nature-based solutions. But focusing here on finance and the tools, that the levers that can be used to fill that finance gap. We have, of course, an overall goal in the draft post-2020 framework to close that financing gap. And then we have a number of targets which identify and address some of those potential levers to do that. And I just want to sort of highlight 4 of those. So the first of them is about integrating these different values of biodiversity into everything we do, and in particular, in this context, aligning financial flows with the goals of this new agenda of protecting biodiversity. The second, that's in the draft target 14. The second is looking specifically at businesses and looking at the dependencies that businesses have on biodiversity, the impacts they have, and looking at measures to disclose, to I understand what those impacts and dependencies are, and then to progressively reduce those impacts, target 15. Another target focuses on subsidies. Currently, as we know, we are investing in the destruction of nature to a greater extent than the protection of nature, with over 500 billion a year in government subsidies and probably 5 times that in harmful investments overall in biodiversity. That needs to be turned around. Those subsidies need to be reformed so that we can then use part of those funds to address this final lever, which is, of course, mobilizing financial resources themselves from public sector, from private sector, and including international finance. We very much welcome these reports. We believe that there are a lot of things that can be done in terms of voluntary initiatives by businesses and by governments, even before we have the adoption of the post-2020 framework. But the G20, of course, and the G7 play a particular role and have a particular responsibility in leading the changes that need to happen, in mobilizing resources, in addressing the subsidy issue. The upcoming WTO, delayed WTO negotiations on fisheries is one first opportunity there. And also, of course, putting in place the public policies and the correct safeguards to ensure that nature-based solutions are used to support these overall objectives of biodiversity conservation and supporting the benefits to people. They must be used alongside other measures, notably, of course, reducing the emissions of greenhouse gas, reducing greenhouse gas emissions rather than replacing them or merely offsetting them. We must make sure, of course, that in the mobilization of finance for nature-based solutions, that we also build from the bottom up with the full engagement of indigenous peoples and local communities. But with that, I know we're short of time. I'll hand back to you, Justin, and thank you very much again for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. And let me not try and summarize any of that, but go straight to Claudia, please, to hear of the new government's plans, but also as the G7 presidency year, and obviously a country that's doing a lot domestically, but would love your thoughts, please, Claudia, in terms of this report and where are we to close this gap.
Thank you very much, Justin. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to share some insights with you on what we are thinking about on financing nature-based solutions from the German government. And as Justin said, we have a new government since the end of last year, as you know, but actually also the previous government has been already a proponent for nature-based solutions. But this is even more so the case maybe for the new government, and we can see this. We have now the Green Party is part of our government coalition, and there are some very interesting new developments. There is, for example, a focus in the coalition agreement on natural climate protection, and that means actually nature-based solutions. So there's a kind of a German term for that, which is a very strong wording in this coalition agreement. And that shows that will be a priority. And for example, our environment ministry is now also currently preparing a national action program on natural climate protection. And we see also that the environment ministry and the agriculture ministry are actually speaking much more closely than before. They are both headed by the Green Party, and they just announced a new strategic alliance with the objective of an ecological, inclusive and economically viable transformation of agriculture. So this points really to these issues that also David mentioned. It's about subsidies, phasing out harmful subsidies in agriculture and repurposing targeted support for environmental protection. So I think these are all very good news. And with the G7 presidency, of course, also their climate and biodiversity agenda is a key priority for us, for Germany, and also under the heading nature-based solutions. But of course, we will link up on previous initiatives from G7, G20, and also COP26 with the objective to further increase ambition, sustainable finance, but also concrete implementation. So on the question what needs to be done, I think it's really we need to push more for this on the international agenda. Of course, CBD COP was already mentioned by David, is also upcoming. So it's really a good year, I think, to push this topic on the international agenda. And now speaking a little bit on development cooperation, what we do under my ministry, the Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. We, of course, it's also a multitude of actions. Of course, partially it's under the heading of biodiversity finance. Yeah, it's the constant effort to increase biodiversity finance, which we have already increased from 400 million per year to 600 million. And we want to further increase it this year to 800 million. And that is the path we want to continue. And but then, of course, it's also in the international funds. Yeah, there are the GEF replenishments, for example. Negotiations are ongoing right now, and as part of the German position, we are pushing for a greater focus on nature-based solutions. Of course, also the global biodiversity framework will be key. And another issue is that we have like the NDC partnership and other vehicles which we want to use to help NBS financing and implementation on the ground, as we know that a lot of partner countries have now also NBS, nature-based solutions, in their national adaptation plans and in their NDCs, in their national determination contributions plans. So I think there is some work to be done. And what is very important from our perspective, from the development perspective, is also the benefits to people and the referral to the development objectives. So it's not just about bringing together the biodiversity, climate, and land degradation agenda. It's also to really bring it together with the Agenda 2030 and real benefits to people. And I'm very glad that also David mentioned that importance of safeguards, as well as that it comes also from bottom up and really involves local communities and indigenous people. So in BMZ, we have a whole range of multilateral initiatives, also multi-stakeholder initiatives. I don't want to go into detail and bore you with that. Maybe you have heard some, like the Blue Action Fund or Save Our Mangroves Now or the African Forest Landscape Restoration Initiative, etc. But the important point is they are all multi-stakeholders. So I think another key message is what do we need to do? We need more multi-stakeholder initiatives. We need all actors. We need the private sector. We need civil society actors, and to get this done, to make it work, but also to get the financing. And coming to the State of Finance for Nature report, of course, we very much welcome.
So we'll give Claudia a chance to come back in a second, but we're actually running a little bit over time. So it gives me a chance to bring in Ivo to get into the meat of the discussion today, which is really the findings of this report. So maybe Ivo, could we go straight to you and to some of the key insights that we want to share today?
Yeah, thanks, Justin, and also warm welcome on behalf of UNEP. For those who don't know me, my name is Ivo Mulder, and I lead the Climate Finance Unit. I'll just be giving you a snapshot of the report, which is also available on the homepage of UNEP. And I very much also welcome any questions, insights, feedback, be it positive or negative, either during or after the event, to be provided. Can we go to the next slide, please? I think what is important at the onset, given that the topic of NBS, even though it's been cropping up over the past years, is still a relatively new concept. So what does it mean? It basically means to put nature at the heart of societal solutions related to the climate crisis, the food crisis, or biodiversity loss. And what do you have to think about? It's not just only, let's say, the typical preservation of national parks or important biodiversity areas, but also think about green roofs in cities or green spaces that provide cooling during heat waves, increasing the space that rivers have, or natural protection against flood surges by investing in mangroves, for example. So it's really seeing and investing in nature as a solution to protecting coastlines, to make cities and keep cities livable as a form of adaptation to increase climate extremes, and obviously also to change, for example, the way our agricultural system operates by making sure that it doesn't emit, but by, for example, reducing emissions, for example, through agroforestry and other forms. So I think it's important to get some practicality around this. But in terms of the numbers itself, this report found that in G20 countries, about 120 billion is being spent on nature-based solutions overall. And this presents the majority of total amounts of public and private investments overall, which in last year's report, we estimated at around 133 billion dollars. So what it means is that the amount of money that is being spent by both public and private sectors is mostly spent in G20 countries themselves. The future annual investments need have been calculated at 536 billion a year by 2050. And most of the investment needs accrue in non-OECD countries. So the investment gap to be bridged, as you can see on the right-hand side, is big in both cases. In the case of G20 countries, it needs to increase by 165%. But in non-OECD countries, it will have to increase with a few orders of magnitude more. And what you will see in some of the next slides is that the fiscal leeway that many developing countries have is much less. So this also speaks, in my view, to how ODA can best be, official development assistance can best be harnessed, but also how can private investment not just be catalyzed in developed countries, but also in developing countries, both developing G20 countries as well as developing non-G20 countries. Next slide, please. What I found staggering is that in most countries, the private sector represents around 60% of a country's GDP. But we have only found 14 billion a year in private investment going towards nature-based solutions, activities, and assets, meaning that it's a sliver of what is actually necessary, and it really puts front and center the necessity of improving and strengthening the investment case, be it in the form of creating stable and long-term income in the form of forest carbon or other ecosystem services, or making sure that, for example, the environmental externalities are embedded in the goods that we are consuming on a daily basis and buying in supermarkets, for example. So both positive incentives will have to be provided in order to incentivize fund managers, banks, and corporates to invest with positive social environmental impact, including on nature, climate, and land degradation, while at the same time asking companies to disclose nature-related and climate-related risk and making sure that we pay the true value of food. In terms of ODA, official development assistance, that is 2% as the report calculates. But as I will highlight again in one of the next slides, given the funding gap, particularly in non-G20 countries, it is extremely crucial to make sure that both the total amount of ODA were to rise, but also to see how ODA can best be harnessed to make sure that it tackles the land degradation, biodiversity, and climate crisis at the same time. And through that, also incentivize the private sector to invest not just in G20 countries, but also in non-G20 countries. Next slide, please. So the 60% of total annual NBS needed lies in non-G20 countries where the fiscal space is limited. Interestingly, the report did a debt to GDP ratio analysis. In other words, what is the amount of debt that a country has accrued relative to the size of the economy? And obviously, the more debt a country has accrued relative to the size of the economy, the more risk an investor attaches to it, and therefore the more expensive it is to borrow on international capital markets. Over the past years, interest rates have been extremely low, in some cases negative for some developed economies. That may change, but the fiscal and financial leeway for many developing countries is limited to close this NBS investment gap, which again puts an onus on G20 countries to lead by example. And given this G20 leaders communique living in harmony with nature and making sure that it's on the path to recovery, it puts even more emphasis and responsibility on the need for the richest nations to lead by example, to do that for their own countries, but also to see what can be done in the context of the three Rio Conventions and in the context of ODA and catalyzing sustainable private investment. Next slide, please. The other thing that I would like to highlight, which again is making a case to invest in non-OECD countries, is that from a pure economic perspective, it is often more cost-effective to invest in nature-based solutions in non-G20 countries than it is in G20 countries, simply because the operational cost or the capital expenditure costs are lower on a per hectare basis. Obviously, there are other issues such as social and political risk, credit risk that are attached to it. But when you look at the actual effectiveness from a land degradation, from a climate and nature perspective, often it is more beneficial to invest in non-G20 countries. Next slide. I've got two more to go, and then I'll be also interested to hear from participants as well. So in order to meet the established targets, G20 countries need to invest an additional 165 billion a year by 2050, on top of the 120 billion being invested on an annual basis present. Global investment needs in nature-based solutions need to increase fourfold by 2050, again on an annual basis, to 536 billion a year, I would also like to highlight that this is a very conservative estimate because we've only looked at land-related nature-based solutions, and we will endeavor to include the marine environment. Moreover, we've used a 2-degree climate scenario, and as you know, Glasgow COP26 was all about keeping the 1.5 degrees alive, given the massive difference that that society will face if we are breaching this 1.5 degree warming. And there's a need for a standardized approach to value in defining nature-based solutions, and perhaps Claudia Hieper would have some reflections on this. There are markers, of course, for climate and biodiversity. There are no markers for nature-based solutions. It is a topic that itself has led to a lot of discussion, but we would also feel that it is needed to have a standardized approach to how we define, frame, and track nature-based solutions. And perhaps this report is a starting point on which to build. Next slide. This is my last one. The need to align economic recovery post-COVID with the international nature and climate targets is absolutely of paramount importance. I would very much hope that the CBD in consultation with member states is successful in putting forward an ambitious global biodiversity framework post-2020. Scaling up domestic, private, and ODA spending is critical, including repurposing of fiscal policies. And I thought that Claudia's example of the environment and agricultural ministries working together to see not so much how fiscal policies can be reduced, but how they can be repurposed and reformed to help farmers, but to do so in a way that transforms food systems is, I think, extremely important. And as I mentioned before, and the last point I would like to highlight is the increased efficiency for increased investments in non-G20 countries. And I would also hope that we will get some feedback from participants on some of these points. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to you, Justin.
Ivo, thank you, and thank you for going through that. Just one point, I know there's several comments about will presentations be available, and all of the materials will be available. The Geneva team has put a link in the chat, but presentation and the recording of this webinar will be available. So please go there for all of this afterwards. But we're getting some great comments and questions in the chat, which I'll come back to in a second. I just want to turn to the 3 panelists though now, and I wonder if you could pull up the last slide, the conclusion slide that or the recommendation slide that Ivo just had, to say there's 4 very clear recommendations there. We heard some examples, Claudia, from you, and great to have you back. I'm sorry you had an internet problem, as we've all had over in our new virtual world. But so maybe you could incorporate any points in this question as well. But these 4 recommendations that are here around aligning economic recovery, around scaling up both domestic but also overseas and development finance, repurposing, and then really thinking about the efficiency of that. And I think maybe the private sector was on the previous slide, Ivo. But just, I mean, they all sound good, and yet we're still falling so far short. And I just wonder, what's the 1, 2 things that we really need to see this year if we're going to start to close the gap? This is a critical year, as you've said, David. Maybe I could come to you first, and just short answers so we can get some of the questions in the Q&A as well. But what are 1, 2 things that are realistic that we can do? We'll go to you, then Claudia, and then Ivo, just with quick thoughts on that, please.
Maybe just 2 quick points. One, I think, of course, at COP26, we saw an agreement to ratchet up the NDCs again this year before COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. I think we have an opportunity at COP15 to use this as a moment for those enhanced contributions to the NDCs that nature-based solutions can provide. So we already saw some good moves in this direction in Glasgow, but let's use Kunming as an additional opportunity for countries to step up their game on investing in nature-based solutions, which will contribute obviously to giving a head start to the post-2020 framework, but also contribute to the climate agenda. And then just a quick second point, which is, looking at Eva's presentation just there and looking at this problem of the fiscal space in developing countries, a lot of non-G20 countries, and this point that a lot of these limitations in the fiscal space is created by debt. What is the role of debt relief, and can we expect some initiatives, further initiatives, additional to the limited ones we saw in terms of COVID response?
Thank you, David. And Claudia, maybe turn to you. There's also several good questions in the Q&A about small island states and debt relief as an option, even if they're not qualifying for ODA. So any thoughts from you on that question and the sort of the question I asked?
Yes, I mean, just very brief. I want to highlight out of the points listed there, the fiscal policies. It's not easy, but I think it's key. And the second point, I see a momentum that arose from COP26, from the climate COP, that there is now this greater focus on adaptation. And I see a great potential for NBS, nature-based solutions, and adaptation. And also, I think it would be good to turn more to sectors like agriculture and urban development, which have been neglected in the NBS debate. So these are my 2 points. On the debt issue, yes, indeed, it's something that I'm also, debt for nature swaps and the whole debate, it's tricky, but we have to think it together because, of course, we know the fiscal space these days in developing countries is and also is very tight. So, but I don't have a very detailed answer, I must say, to the colleagues from small island states. And just also commenting on one of the comments on the NDC partnership I made, actually that's not real yet. No, there is some thinking. How can we also bring NBS to the NDC partnership? But I think it was a misunderstanding that I didn't want to say that we are now starting to channel NBS finance through the NDC partnership. That's not yet, and that is not planned for now.
Very good. Thank you for picking that up. Eva, let me turn to you with your thoughts on the top couple of things you would want to do or see this year.
So I think one I mean, everybody talks about the necessity to scale up private finance, and unless we change the market conditions through fiscal policies or trade-related tariffs or paying the true price of food, as Peter Bakker from WBCSD would say, we'll basically have to incentivize banks and investors to do it differently than they've been doing it to date. And the word concessional finance or providing capital at below market rates is a good lever to make that happen. The problem at the moment is that Convergence put out reports that showed that the amount of concessional finance actually dropped 50% last year. The second problem is that even if this is made available through multilateral funds or from governments, it often takes a relatively long time and it comes with high transaction cost. So the total amount needs to increase, but also the speed by which this is being approved and made available to impact investors, institutional investors, development banks, and others needs to scale up. So that's one point. The second is with inflation rising in many developed economies, there's a high likelihood that interest rates at some stage will rise, including for sovereign debt. I think there is a small window of opportunity before that happens to borrow at virtually zero interest or even negative interest to, for example, set up a nature and climate emergency fund. That could be one opportunity for G20 nations to consider. Those are two points that I would like to bring up.
Great, some really good ones, and I love the fact adaptation is coming into this because I think that also addresses some of the questions I'm seeing in the chat, and great to see so much coming in there. It's also great to see some people actually sort of laying out some of the solutions or the ideas you got, and if you sort of can write those into the chat. I see something from Nikki Kemp in terms of solutions that are being worked on, then that's all going to be sort of richness that we can sort of try and tie together as we think about summarizing this this discussion as well. There's a couple of technical questions, and I wonder, I don't want to get into a deep technical debate about the report and the findings, but I wonder, Matteo, if I could just turn to you to ask, particularly on this question of sort of how you've calculated some of the values for G20, non-G20, and this question on physical location that Luciane has put in there. I don't know if you've got any quick thoughts on that.
Sure. So great. That's actually a great question, and this brings me to a point that I keep coming back to every time I speak about this paper, and it's the need to get better data. And I think Ivo mentioned it as well. Like we did our best effort to try and estimate both. So there are two different methodologies, one for current investments and another very different for calculation of future investment needs. On current investments, the strategy there was to get as close to the asset level as possible in every way. So we did not look into pledged amounts. We did not look at transactions that are like further away from the asset level. So we actually did look at how much money is actually flowing into the asset. So what that means is that yes, we do take into account the physical location of the asset when we split the two in current investment needs. Having said that, for private investments, if you look at the report, the data is very scarce, and we had to make some strong assumptions to actually estimate the location of where actual investments are being made by private sector, because there are supply chain considerations, there are all sorts of complications that make that a strong assumption. But yeah, I guess the short answer is in current investment, yes. And in future investment needs, also answering another question I was seeing on chat, we use a model, an integrated assessment model called MAGPIE, developed by the Potsdam Institute for Climate. And basically, what it does is it looks at the investment needs that will happen in each geography. It's very much a spatial model, so we definitely look not only at what G20 versus not G20, but we actually have very small grid cells where we know how much money is going to be needed to get to our 2050 target for both for climate, biodiversity, and land degradation.
Terrific, thank you, Matteo. And I think a lot of what you're laying out is in the appendix of the report for people to see. It's certainly in the appendix of the original 2021 report as well. So would encourage people to go there, but I know Matteo would be happy to take questions offline as well. But thank you for that. And I think a lot of what you're saying also highlights this importance that Ivo pointed to, that we haven't got an established methodology for tracking investments. And so this part of this work is to start to sort of create a regular cycle of reporting what we're seeing, tracking the investments that are coming in. We all know we need to sort of, we manage what we measure. And so let's start measuring this investment. And I think that's a key thing for that we hope that this report will stimulate. I want to turn now to a question though that is there around how we see this type of data coming out and how that might affect donor thinking in terms of access to funding, particularly for some of the more vulnerable populations, some of the more vulnerable states, the small island states that were mentioned, indigenous peoples, this social dimension as well that I know is so important for you, Claudia, and for all the work BMZ does. And so I wonder if you want to say a few more words on that, and then the follow-on question, Ivo, is the report considered this opportunity of incentivizing people in different ways, or is that does that come next? So any quick thoughts on that would be great.
Yes, indeed. Of course, like least developed countries we have a major focus on in our projects. And of course, it's also about incentives. So that kind of leads to the other question. So I think it's about incentives And it's also about, of course, there was a question on the barriers for this changing the fiscal policies, because it's complex. Yeah, I think the answer is that the cross-sectoral cooperation between ministries, even in Germany, is not always the best. And this is the same around the world. And so we have to showcase on the ground, and that's what we do in our partner countries, where there is, of course, will also of the partners. Then we can showcase it, we can provide good examples, we can also provide financial incentives, and then hopefully from a, let's say, smaller effort, it can be upscaled and taken up by the government. Yeah. So, but that is, I mean, and then I want to come back on another question on the insurance question, because we have this into resilience initiative that we are supporting. So, and that is also linked to nature-based solutions. So they also provide products, and they have a platform. So maybe, I don't know if I have the link or somebody else knows the link, but otherwise you can just Google into resilience. And that is also a very interesting, innovative approach to link private sector and NBS in very vulnerable countries.
Terrific, and I want to come back to this point on private sector in a minute. But Ivo, any thoughts from you on that question?
Yeah, just I see also a question from John Willis. So indeed, it's not by wish, but indeed from a perspective of data, budget, and timing that we excluded oceans in this report and the global report. We are envisioning a report in 2022 that will also include the marine environment as well. On the other questions about parameters for lenders, I think it's interesting. So as people probably know, the European Commission has put out the Sustainable Financial Disclosure Regulation. So the necessity for lenders and investors to disclose, as well as what is called a taxonomy on sustainable finance, basically indicating what is deemed sustainable and what isn't, which was first debated more from a technical perspective and then later from a political perspective. But there, both lenders, but also NGOs and other organizations were able to work and inform the European Commission about how the taxonomy needed to be structured. So are there parameters for lenders influencing government's MBS policies? I would say not by default, but by developing a taxonomy for sustainable finance. And this is, for example, now also in development in Indonesia and in other countries. Both lenders, but also other organizations have the possibility to inform what is being deemed sustainable for different sectors, including for, say, agriculture, forestry, and other sectors for which NBS is very relevant. So I'm hoping to have answered that question. I'm not sure the question on how is that sustainable if collateral is insecure. I mean, from a sovereign perspective, a lot of countries have the ability to, especially if they're issuing debt in their own currency, to for quantitative easing. But obviously, the debt to GDP ratio is a very important measure of the degree to which debt is sustainable. And at least in the EU, there are floors that countries have agreed they would not go above. Over to you, Justin.
Thank you, Ivo. And so we're starting to run a little tight on time, but I see a number of discussions or chat questions in there about private sector. It's clearly a key recommendation from the report. I think the private sector often looks at nature and thinks, well, how can it invest in a way to actually sort of unlock value? A couple of good questions in there from Ben Valk, I see, but and a great example, Claudia, on sort of how you can work with insurance to actually sort of make more of this investable as well. But I wonder if the panelists could give sort of 1-2 examples of kind of where and how you see that we are going to be able to mobilize the private sector. There is a couple of questions on carbon markets, which is often a sort of default option as we talk about nature-based solutions, but it's only one of the instruments that we need to be thinking about. But thoughts on the evolution of the carbon market, thoughts on private sector coming in more broadly would really be welcome as we move towards a sort of wrap. So I'll sort of try and use that as a as your final comments as well. So if there's any last thing you think you've missed, please bring that in as well. So David, if I turn to you again first, last couple of thoughts.
Thank you. I mean, I think the key leverage for the private sector is perhaps looking at these dependencies and impacts, and we certainly look forward to the task force on nature-related financial disclosures that Executive Secretary Elizabeth Morema co-chairs as helping to move this along. We know that they will come out this year with some beta version, if you like, of a framework to facilitate that, so that the private sector can progressively reduce those negative impacts and improve and progressively increase the positive impacts. And then I think the other key thing is what I mentioned earlier in relation to carbon markets and other ways that the private sector is incentivized to invest in nature-based solutions, is the importance of making sure that those safeguards are in place. I think we saw good progress in Glasgow at COP26 in terms of a compromise towards that, to make sure that we see additionality, that there's only a limited capacity for offsetting. We need to, I think, learn from the experience of REDD+ to make sure that again that investments are both good for nature. We need to be ecologically literate in the way we do this, and also with the local communities, indigenous peoples in the driving seat.
Very good. Thank you, David. Claudia, to you, if you could just do a 1 minute on that question.
Yeah, very short. I think it's very important to combine financing facilities and technical support. So it's not just about big funds. It has to go along with technical support to ensure that it's done properly, that there's a monitoring systems, that there are good examples with the safeguards in place, etc. So that's the message. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Nice and short. Ivo, to you.
I mean, what I would say is a stable and predictable revenue flows. That's what the private and finance sector needs. And that is exactly not what the carbon and especially voluntary carbon markets has provided. Now, with the race to zero that you've been part of, Justin, and with a lot of companies having pledged to invest in nature-based solutions as a means to become net zero by 2050, there is, of course, increased demand now. What it would need to be coupled with is some kind of floor price to say, okay, a project developer or investor would know that a certain price will not go below a certain level, and if so, there would be a fund or mechanism that would shore it up, so that those who are investing in it would know that they can quantify future cash flows discounted at the present time. So I think that is extremely important.
Very good. I couldn't agree more. Matteo, a very quick word from you, if you'd like to before we wrap.
Not really. I think my fellow panelists have captured the essence of the Q&A, because I was reading it carefully, and the questions around, I guess the only question that remains to be answered from the technical side of things is about publishing targets in terms of areas instead of investment needs, which I think is a good idea, and we might have take that into account for a future iteration of this exercise, because I think there is plenty of space to improve the data exercise that was done here, and rather than take this as an endpoint, I think we should take this as a starting point.
Very good. Thank you, Matteo. So I'm going to wrap very quickly, recognizing we've had a very broad conversation, but I think 4 points. Everybody on this call, I think, understands the critical importance of nature. It's raised up the agenda, and we've got this critical year, as David highlighted at the beginning, and the confluence of the 3 COP, CBD, CCD, and the UNFCCC. And so how do we really continue to build the great momentum we saw from Glasgow and nature, the opening of Kunming, to really sort of move this forward? Secondly, this report continues to highlight the extraordinary gap that we have We've got lots of nice words, but how do we start getting serious about closing the gap? Thirdly, we've got some good examples. We know what needs to be done. We've heard some of the examples that are there, but we're not doing nearly enough. So how do we now start bringing those real examples to life, whether it's on subsidy reform, whether it's on some of the really more promising cutting edge ODA type opportunities, some of repurposing domestic policy towards ensuring nature positive outcomes. And then I think fourthly, what we desperately need is this partnership. We need more partnership, and it sometimes slows us down. But the only way we're going to solve this, if we want to unlock private sector, we need that to be aligned with how public sector, how policy is going to work. And if we want to sort of, how do we think about the insurance? What role can ODA play to actually sort of bring more private sector in? We're going to have to get smarter about that if we're really serious. So lots of opportunity, but also lots of challenge. With that, let me hand back to our host, Diana, who I think wants to just talk briefly about future meetings. But thank you. Please join me in thanking the panelists for a really rich discussion, Vivid for the great analysis behind the report, and Diana, to you for hosting another great session. So back to you.
Thank you very much, Justin, and to all the panelists. Justin, for your excellent moderation. We are ending just on time. For those interested in the meetings that the Convention on Biological Diversity will host in Geneva in March, we have already organized a few sessions in preparation of those meetings, and we are trying to find a date that can suit the Secretariat to organize one more of these briefings. Just to bring to your attention that we have a few events coming up next week. The United Nations Environment Assembly is going to take place at the end of February, and we have been discussing a lot plastics. We'll have a high-level session, a high-level dialogue on a global instrument on plastic pollution this upcoming Tuesday. Next week in Geneva, many actors will be mobilized for the International Environmental Peace Building Conference, and we will also host a session there. And then later in February, we'll also have other events in preparation for the United Nations Environmental Assembly. As it was mentioned, the summary of this event, the video, the documents that have been presented, the links that have been shared will be made available on the webpage that has been shared by my colleagues in the chat. And if some questions remained unanswered, we will check with our colleagues from the UNEP Climate Finance Unit and bring those answers to the attendees. Thank you very much to all.